Constantinople was the capital of the entire world. So now everyone thinks London is the capital of the world, or they think Washington or New York or these cities are the capital of the world. Constantinople was bigger than all of those cities combined. It was the center of the world. Can you imagine in the 600s, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, after being exiled from Mecca to Medina, small group of Muslims, and he's saying that one day our group, this group of Muslims, is going to conquer the capital of the world. Salim III understood we need to take the Ottomans forward. So he wanted to reform the army. He wanted to kind of get rid of the Janissaries in 1789, and he ruled it until 1807. In this period, they had a war with France. This was Napoleon. Napoleon wanted to take Egypt. Selim III was trying to fight against him. And they didn't want to give up Ottoman lands. They never wanted to give up Ottoman lands. But what happened is the beginning of westernization and modernization under the Tanzimat reforms is that people started claiming their own national identity. And this led to a major crisis within the Ottoman Empire. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Key things I want to highlight today is the fall of the Ottoman Empire. So most of you guys, inshallah, will hopefully know about what the Ottoman Empire is and was, and I'll give a quick intro into what the Ottoman Empire was. The Ottoman Empire was the final Islamic caliphate. Who here knows what a caliphate is? You can raise your hand if you know what a caliphate is, inshallah. Who here knows what Ertugrul is? The show, Dirilish Ertugrul. More people know what Ertugrul is than the caliphate is, mashallah. Dirilish Ertugrul was a series that was based on the father of Osman. Osman Ghazi. Osman was the founder of the Ottoman Empire. He lived in the year 1254 to 1299. He was just the Ottoman Qayi Bey. In 1299, he founded the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire lasted until 1922. And Osman Ghazi died in 1326 after the conquest of Bursa. Some sources say 1324. Osman Ghazi, the term Uthman in Arabic, Osman is the Turkish equivalent of Osman, became known as Ottoman. Osmanli is the Turkish word. Ottoman came as derivatives, Arabic derivative of the word Osman, which was the founder of the Ottoman Empire. He was basically a small Anatolian beylik. He ruled a small Anatolian beylik. Anatolia is the modern land of Turkey. He ruled a small area, a small tribe known as the Kayy, and they moved into the Byzantine border. The Byzantines at the time of this period, this was known as 1300s, mid-late 1200s. There was something called the Byzantine Empire, which was basically the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, and then they had the Mongol Empire. The Mongols were like the biggest empire at the time, originating from Mongolia. And then you had a small group of Turks in Anatolia. You had then the Abbasid Caliphate, which was dwindling in power in Baghdad. Then you had the Ayyubids in Egypt. So the Islamic world is very fragmented, and even the Turkish tribes, they were very fragmented. The reason the Turkish tribes are very fragmented is that they were nomadic. So one tribe would move from here to there, and they would constantly be moving. And so therefore there was no form of real unity for any Anatolian tribe. What happened is a guy named Usman came in and said, I want to unite all these tribes. He united many of the tribes, and that's where you get the term Osmanli or Ottoman. And from then they started conquering some land. In 1299, Osman had a dream that a tree came out of his chest. Sorry, I just touched the mic. A tree came out of his chest and took over many parts of Europe, Asia, and Africa, which made up the modern Ottoman lands. And that was where the first dream, or the first beginnings of the Ottoman Empire happened in 1299. Some people say 1301, but 1299 is a more authentic date. Fast forward, we get to year 1453. So I skip a lot of Ottoman history. You had a lot of conquest and battles. For example, the Battle of Kosovo, where Murad Hodavinger, who's the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire at that time, was the first and only Sultan to be killed in battle. Fast forward many years. So 1299, now we're in 1453, the conquest of Istanbul, Constantinople, by a man named Fatih Sultan Mehmed. Fatih Sultan Mehmed was only one of the early Ottoman sultans. And after his conquest, the Ottomans became known as an empire. By many historians, they became known as an empire. Before they were known as an entity, but they weren't an empire. But after 1453, they became known as an empire. There was an authentic hadith that the Prophet Muhammad said that one day the Muslims will conquer Constantinople or Constantinople. Constantinople was the capital of the entire world. So now everyone thinks London is the capital of the world, or they think Washington or New York or these cities are the capital of the world. Constantinople was bigger than all of those cities combined. It was the center of the world. Can you imagine in the 600s, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, after being exiled from Mecca to Medina, small group of Muslims, and he's saying that one day our group, this group of Muslims, is going to conquer the capital of the world. People would have called him crazy. He's gonna the small group of people who can barely defeat the Quraysh, they're gonna take over the world. How? Then only 800 years later, the Muslims conquered Constantinople. It was Fatih Sultan Mehmed. The Prophet Muhammad said, "What a glorious commander and what a glorious army that would be." In 1453, Fatih Sultan Mehmed of the Ottoman Empire conquered Istanbul, conquered Constantinople, and this opened the gateway into Europe and the rest of the Western world. Fast forward again, we get into the rule of Suleiman the Magnificent. Just before that, there was a man named Selim I, Sultan Selim I, who was the ninth Ottoman Sultan. He's the ninth Ottoman Sultan. He ruled from only 1512 to 1520. 8 years he ruled, only 8 years. In those 8 years, he conquered all of Egypt, Syria, modern-day Saudi Arabia, Iraq, parts of Iran, going into Libya. One man named Sultan Selim I, he was the first Ottoman Caliph. So the term Caliph comes from being the lineage or the descendant or the person who's going to take over the entire Muslim world. The entire Muslim world would be under that Caliph's power. For thousands of years, we've had a Caliph. The Caliphate was abolished in 1924. Before that, the Caliph has always been essentially Arab, or one of the people from the Prophet's tribe, or the descendants of people from the Prophet's tribe. So there was the Umayyads, the Banu Umayyah, from the Banu Umayyah, from descending. So first there was the Rashidun, after the Prophet Muhammad's death, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali radiallahu anhu. Then there was Hassan radiallahu anhu, who ruled for a bit. Then there was the Umayyad dynasty, or the Umayyad Caliphate, which were the descendants of the Banu Umayyah, who were the cousins of the Prophet. There was another tribe in the Quraysh, and they were the descendants of Abu Sufyan and Muawiyah radiallahu anhu, and they were the tribe. Then there was the Abbasids, who overthrew the Umayyads in 750, and they were the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad's uncle Abbas radiallahu anhu, and they were the descendants. So now the caliphate was passed on to the Ottomans, because the Ottomans conquered Egypt. After the Mongols sacked Baghdad in 1258, there was the sacking of Baghdad, which is the capital of the Muslim world. There was now no place for the Caliph to go. The safest place for the Caliph to go was Egypt. So the Caliph went to Egypt and essentially was under the protection of an empire known as the Mamluks. The Mamluks were just a bunch of slave soldiers who claimed to be an empire, and they protected the caliphate. And from I believe it was 1258 to 1517, the Mamluks were the caliphate. The Mamluks were the caliphate. Yavuz Sultan Selim I, went into Egypt and conquered Egypt. When he conquered Egypt, he said, "I'm not going to kill the Caliph. I can't kill the Caliph. This is the protector of Islam." They defeated the Mamluk army, they conquered Egypt, but he did not kill the Caliph. Instead, he took the Caliph back to Istanbul. This Caliph was known as Al-Mutawakkil III. He took him back to Istanbul with him, the capital of the Ottomans at this point, and the Caliph understood that him as a Caliph has no power anyways. He was just a figurehead. And he understood that for the continuation and for the prosperity of Islam, he can no longer be Caliph. So he handed the Caliphate on to Selim I. So therefore Selim I is the first Ottoman Caliph. So now the Ottomans were the Caliphate. They were the center of the Islamic world. They were protectors of the Islamic world, not just of the area they controlled, but Muslims across the world. So the area they controlled maybe was the Middle East, Turkey, going into Eastern Europe. But now they were protector of Muslims in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in India, in modern day India, modern day Pakistan, modern day Bangladesh. Across the world, they were the protector. So now that's the height of the Ottomans. Then you had the likes of Suleiman the Magnificent, who was Selim's son. He was the person who expanded the Ottoman geographically so much. He went on 13 different conquests or campaigns in every direction. He conquered modern day Algeria, Tunisia. Tunisia was under Ottoman control for a bit. Libya. They went into the likes of Eastern Europe. They pushed into Hungary. They went as far as Hungary. They couldn't get to Vienna. In 1529, there was a failed siege of Vienna. But the Ottomans were now conquering loads of land. And Suleiman the Magnificent saw a way of trying to balance Sharia with modern law. So how do I make Sharia fair with Turkish traditions? So he codified Islamic law without Turkish traditions. And that's how you get the modern concept of Turkish law without the Sharia, because it was from Suleiman the Magnificent. And then he died in 1566. I'm aware of my time constraints, so I want to get through a lot in a short amount of time. So following Suleiman the Magnificent is when many scholars try to say this is when the Ottomans began declining. after the death of Suleiman the Magnificent, which I actually disagree a lot with. I don't think the Ottomans were on decline after Suleiman the Magnificent's death, but they began to stagnate. Because prior to this, they were conquering in every direction. They were conquering everywhere. And they were conquering so much land. But after Suleiman the Magnificent's death, and also when we talk about Muslim leaders, or we talk about the caliphs, or we talk about Ottoman sultans, oftentimes we try to praise them or overpraise them. Especially Suleiman, we overpraise them. We give him a lot of credit. And he was an amazing sultan. Absolutely. And some shows nowadays try to discredit him, say he was obsessed with his harem and stuff like that. Forget that. The main reality is that Suleiman the Magnificent, what happened was that he was also very paranoid of someone taking his rule. 46 years he reigned, but he also killed 2 of his sons. It sounds a bit scary. He killed 2 of his sons. Those 2 sons that he killed would have been better Ottoman sultans than the person who eventually became Ottoman sultan, who was known as Sultan Selim II. So just a quick note, side footnote here. For all the Ottoman sultans, a lot of them were given nicknames at the beginning. So there was Osman Ghazi, Orhan Ghazi, Murad Hudavinger, then you had Yildirim Bayezid, which means Thunderbolt Bayezid. Then you had Fatih Sultan Mehmed, the conqueror Sultan Mehmed. You had Yavuz Sultan Selim. Yavuz means like the tough or the stern. You had Bayezid II, the saint, because he brought in a lot of Christians and Jews into Ottoman lands. Then you had Selim II, who is known as Selim the drunkard, because he was very, he wasn't a great Ottoman sultan. He was focused on his harem. He was focused on the drinks. He wasn't really focused. And subhanAllah, a very common thing that you'll see in Ottoman history is that people die in the state that they lived. So Fatih Sultan Mehmed died on conquest. He died on the conquest. Suleiman the Magnificent died on conquest. Yavuz Sultan Selim died because of his horseback. He was always on horseback. He died because of poisoning on his back because he was always on horseback. Selim II died is a tragic death, but it's also quite funny. He was taking a bath and he slipped. And that's how he died. And that's the state in which he died. He died in a state of, he wasn't a warrior. He wasn't a person who was going to take the Ottomans forward. He died in that state. So fast forward, after Selim's death, you had some Ottoman sultans. The Ottomans had adopted a policy of fratricide. Fratricide means that they would kill, so for example, the Ottoman sultan, they would have a son. That son would kill his brothers to prevent those brothers taking the sultanate, and he would therefore be sultan. The reason they did this is to prevent any sort of uprising within the empire. And they try to justify this using the Quranic verse that says, "What good is a brother to a state?" So they tried justifying it through various means, but ultimately this is very cruel. So anytime a sultan would die, the first person to the palace would declare himself sultan and kill the rest of his brothers. They would strangle them. This eventually got too much when a sultan known as Sultan Mehmed III killed 19 of his brothers. And these 19 brothers were when they were very young, they were babies. He killed 19 of his brothers. And what happened is that the person who became caliph, unfortunately, was too young, was very young. And this is known as 1603, when Sultan Ahmed I became the sultan. He was a young man and he didn't have any children. So he did not kill his brother when he became sultan. He did not kill any of his brothers. He simply put them in the palace and made sure they were not allowed to leave the palace. This meant that there was no chance of them uprising against him. And this was a new Ottoman policy. Now, around the 1600s, the Ottomans they were still conquering land, they were still growing, they were doing very well economically, they were doing very well through trade, they were doing very well in comparison to the rest of the world, they were far beyond the rest of the world. But at this point, you can start seeing a point of stagnation. So the Ottomans were on the rise for many, many years. But then in the mid-1600s, you begin seeing stagnation. And this was known as the Sultanate of Women. Sultanate of Women. Begins 1640 with a woman named Hurrem Sultan. So the Ottomans, a lot of the sultans would have concubines in milkimin, which means that they would have people that they would have children with, a lot of children with. So they would have loads and loads of heirs and loads of descendants. But what would happen is that when a woman would give birth to a potential heir to the throne, they would gain a lot of power. Once they gained a lot of power, they would begin. Once they begin gaining a lot of power, that woman would begin taking too much control, and therefore implementing changes within the Ottoman governance and having a lot of impact on who would become sultan. And if that would happen, it would mean that they would often put their child as sultan, even if that child was not fitting of becoming sultan. The sultanate of women. I want to give a quick footnote, quick story before I get into the further reasons as the fall of the Ottomans. Is that there was a man at this Ottoman time known as Shabtai Zevi. Shabtai Zevi. Some say Shabtai Zvi. Shabtai Zvi. Sabbatai space Zevi. I encourage everyone to Google this man. Shabtai Zvi was a man who claimed to be the Messiah. He was a Jewish man, brought up and raised in Ottoman lands. And he claimed to be the Messiah in the mid-1650s. And at the time, the Sultan's name was known as Sultan Mehmed IV. Sultan Mehmed IV. Sultan Mehmed IV was the youngest Sultan ever to rule. He was only 4 years old, or some reports say he was 6 years old when he became Caliph. Now Sultan Mehmed IV, when he began taking more and more control, this man Shabtai Zvi came to him. And he said, he is the Messiah. And if he is the Messiah, he needs some land. And if he claims some land, what's going to happen? He's going to take away from the Ottoman land. So Shabtai Zvi began gaining a large and large following. He's raised in modern-day Macedonia. Modern-day Macedonia, Montenegro, those areas. And he began gaining a large and large following across Europe. England, France, all these areas. And he took them to Ottoman lands. And he claimed, I am the Caliph. I am the Messiah. And he claimed land from Mehmed IV. So Mehmed IV gave a very, very simple solution. Very, very simple solution. He said, if you are the Messiah, and you are the rightfully guided person, and you are so, convinced of your Judaism, and so convinced of your ability to be the Messiah, I'm going to offer you something. I am going to behead you. I'm going to behead you. If you convert to Islam, I will not behead you. A very twisted game that Mehmed IV did. He said, if you convert to Islam, I'm not going to behead you. Because the Messiah, the true Messiah, would not give up anything to be beheaded, to convert to Islam, because he is within his Judaism. So Shabtai Zvi took the decision and converted to Islam. He converted to Islam. What happened then is that when he went to the lands, back to his homeland, and when he converted to Islam, many of the Muslim community were uplifted. Now this man converted to Islam. But some were skeptical, and they called him a term known as Donmeh. Donmeh. Donmeh, there's no English equivalent, but basically this is Ottoman Turkish, not modern Turkish, nor modern Arabic. Ottoman Turkish. Donmeh, it means convert, but not a real convert. Like it's a convert, but with a negative connotation. It's like a bad convert. So Shabtai Zvi and his followers became known as Donmeh. And what he founded was something called crypto-Muslim Jews. Crypto-Muslim Jews. There are people who are outwardly Muslim. Back then, your appearance, what you would wear in your clothing, would be able to tell you apart. So Muslims would wear a big turban. The Jewish rabbis would have the clothing of a rabbi. They have the kippah and they would have Jewish clothing. So Shabtai Zvi, when he converted to Islam, became outwardly Muslim. And he would pray during Ramadan, he would fast during Ramadan, he'd pray his 5 salah. But inwardly, he remained Jewish. Inwardly, he remained Jewish. And what he would do is he would still fast during the Sabbath, or he would still read the Hebrew. And so Shabtai Zvi and his followers, when they got found out for not being true to the Islam, were exiled back to their homeland, and that's where they died. Modern day Macedonia, Montenegro, that area. What happened is the Donmeh began becoming very, very powerful in Turkey. And we're going to touch on someone who was part of the Donmeh very soon, later on. So just park that for a moment. What happened is that the sultans began being locked into their palaces because they didn't want to kill the sultans anymore. So many of the sultan's children and brothers and whatever would be locked up in a palace. Prior to this, a sultan who would not be locked up would be a very capable individual. They would be educated in horseback riding, in battle strategy, in the arts, in science, and all these different things. But when a sultan became locked up, so for example, a brother became locked up, and the lineage was no longer your son becomes the caliph, and then his son becomes the caliph, and then his son becomes the caliph, that was no longer the lineage. It would be, my son becomes the caliph, then his brother becomes the caliph, then his brother would become the caliph, etc., etc., etc. Those people would not be as educated. And a lot of them developed mental illness, because being locked up and confined in a space for so long, no connection with the outside world, nothing. That ultimately the Ottoman sultans would no longer be the brave, commanding sultans of the past, where they would take the take the army into battle. They would mainly give the power to the Grand Vizier, because the Grand Vizier would be educated. So that's when you see the beginning of the decline of the abilities of the Ottoman sultans. And this happens around 1700s. So now you get into 1700s. This is known as the Tulip period. 1700s, the Ottomans, they were stagnating, but you could see a small beginning of decline. Mid 1700s. Mid 1700s, you could see beginning of decline. They began losing wars. Main enemy was Russia and Austro-Hungarian Empire. They began having many battles and they began losing some of those battles. The British started making them lose some of the battles. But in the 1700s, they didn't actually lose that much land. Very little land they lost. Very little. They didn't lose much land. But internally, they began becoming weaker. And I'll tell you why. So the Ottomans had a policy known as Devshirme, the Devshirme system. The Devshirme system would take, so the Ottomans were majority Muslim empire, but at the beginning of the Ottomans, they were majority Christian empire. They were majority Christian empire, which means that they needed to have some Muslim majority. They needed to have some Muslim army presence, right? So what they would do is in each village, Christian village, they would maybe have, a family of four boys. They would take one Christian boy from that village. That one Christian boy would come and they would be converted to Islam, and they would be studying with many other Christian boys within that system, the Devshirme system. Many, if they were smart, they would go into the governance. So they would go into Grand Vizier, or they would go into the government, they would go into basic administration. And the ones who weren't as smart, but more physical, more sports driven, would go into the Janissary Corps. The Janissary Corps became very well known for being one of the best armies in all of Europe. They were the gunpowder army. They would defeat basically any army. But in the mid 1700s, this system began changing. The Janissaries started going from this elite group of army soldiers, Christian boy soldiers who converted to Islam, to politically active free men. And they would choose who the Sultan would be. So in 1789, a very forward-thinking Sultan named Sultan Selim III, very forward-thinking, he wanted to bring life to the Ottoman Empire. Before that, prior to that, many of the Ottoman Sultans, you had Abdul Hamid I, Abdul Hamid II, Abdul Hamid I, you had Mahmud I, you had some of these Ottoman Sultans, they weren't forward-thinking. They would give the power to the Grand Vizier. They were good men maybe in their akhlaq and their Islam, but they wouldn't take the Ottomans forward. Selim III understood we need to take the Ottomans forward. So he wanted to reform the army. He wanted to kind of get rid of the Janissaries in 1789, and he ruled it until 1807. In this period, they had a war with France. This was Napoleon. Napoleon wanted to take Egypt. Selim III was trying to fight against him. And they didn't want to give up Ottoman lands. They never wanted to give up Ottoman lands. But the Janissaries began seeing that if this guy stays in charge, he's going to get rid of me. They deposed him. Then another Sultan came in, Sultan Mustafa. They deposed him. Then another Sultan came in, Sultan Mahmud II. And they thought that he would be okay. Then in 1826, something known as the auspicious event happened, where every single Janissary, around 250,000, were killed. 250,000 Janissaries, these are the people, politically active free men, the army, were killed and were replaced by the new model army. And this new model army was far better because they were military trained. They weren't people who were just politically active free men. They were trained and they understood how to fight. And they understood battle and they understood strategy. Also at this period, you had something called the Tanzimat reforms. Modern Western, not Westernization, but you see modernization. The Ottomans had an apathy toward modernization because many of the scholars at the time said this is haram. Many of the scholars said this is haram. To try and modernize an empire, they said no. To implement new technological changes, haram. To go into debt to the West, it's haram. And what happened is that the Ottomans began falling 100 years behind the West. Whilst the Western world was off colonizing the rest of the entire world, the Ottomans remained very far behind. This is 1800s. You can see the gap. 1700s, you couldn't see the gap really. But when you get into 1800s, the beginning of the Enlightenment period, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution period, you see the beginnings of how far the Ottomans are behind Europe. And that's when all the problems begin. And this is where the major declining power of the Ottomans begin, 1800s. So the Tanzimat reforms was an attempt to try and modernize the empire. But in actuality, what it did is it westernized the empire. And this leads to later on major issues as well. But the initial intention was to modernize, to give more rights to the Christians, to give more rights to the Jewish community, to get more taxation, to bring in wealth for the Ottomans. And it did work. But as time went on, so you get to 1839, and this is the death of Mahmud II, the Sultan Mahmud II, who was a person who modernized the empire, but was still strict with his Islamic values. He still maintained his Islamic values. His son, however, was a man named Abdul Majid I. who ruled from 1839 to 1861. At this time, the Ottomans were losing a lot of land. 1826, they lost Greece. So they began losing some lands. Prior to that, they lost Hungary in 1700s. They lost Hungary. So they were losing parts of the Balkans, and they lost Greece in 1826. So now you're thinking, okay, what's going to happen? And there was a long period where the Ottomans almost didn't win any battles. Crimea, Russia were pushing down on Crimea against the Ottoman border. Iran, they were losing some areas in Iraq. So Ottomans were constantly in constant conjunction, constant losing of land. Then when Abdul Majid I comes into power, he puts the second Tanzimat reforms. He wants to further modernize the empire. But what he did is he further westernized it. Secular values begin being implemented into the Ottoman Caliphate. This is still a caliphate, remember? The person who's at the helm is responsible for all Muslims. But he begins secularizing the empire. He begins modernizing and westernizing the empire. He begins taking debt from the West. And when he starts taking debt from the West, yes, the Ottomans started becoming more modern. Train lines were implemented, more modern trains, modernization. Schooling was better. The Ottomans were now more educated. But also what was happening is that the Ottomans began questioning many Ottoman citizens. So prior to this, a person from Bulgaria and a person from Turkey, or a person from Iraq, or a person from modern day Saudi, these are all nation states, right? We know them as nation states. But back then, they were part of the Ottoman regime. I'm Ottoman. I am not Bulgarian, I'm not Turkish, I'm Ottoman. But what happened is the beginning of westernization and modernization under the Tanzimat reforms is that people started claiming their own national identity. And this led to a major crisis within the Ottoman Empire. Who wants to be part of the Ottomans if they believe in their own state? So this is the key reason to why the Ottomans began collapsing. So I talked about one, the sultans started becoming uneducated. Without educated leader, an empire cannot thrive. Number one. Number two is the growing Western powers. The Ottomans began falling behind the Western powers because of their failure to modernize. So the Ottomans began failing to modernize, and therefore they began to decline. They also failed to keep up with the rest of the Western world in their technological advancements, and so therefore they were left behind. Number three is that they were internally a bit weak. The Janissaries, there was internal unrest, no one knew, and they had an uneducated population. But now number four is that nationalism began rising. And nationalism is a topic we'll talk about in a moment when we talk about World War I. So then you think, okay, what's going to happen? After Sultan Abdul Majid the First's death, there was a man named Abdul Aziz, who was his brother, who became Ottoman Sultan. And this man loved his luxury. He lived a luxurious life. And he also spent so much money of the Ottoman. He spent so much of the Ottoman Empire's money. And he spent it on palaces, he spent it on warfare, they had some unsuccessful wars. And he went and traveled the entire of Europe. But what happened in 1875 is the Ottomans became completely bankrupt. They declared bankruptcy. And they started taking further loans from the West. And the West decided to create the Ottoman administration for Ottoman administration's debt. So how much debt the Ottoman owes each country. Abdul Aziz, he was a good sultan, but he led the Ottomans into so much peril. In 1877, the Ottomans went into war with Russia, and by 1878, half the Balkans went. So Ottomans are now constantly facing issues. Algeria was snatched by the French in 1826, the beginning of the Algerian War, and the Emir Abdul Qadir, I hope you guys know who Emir Abdul Qadir is, he tried to fight out against the French. But the Ottomans couldn't send an army. They couldn't even defend their own land. So Ottomans are now constantly losing wars and losing wars. And in 1853, they became known as the sick man of Europe. Basically, Europe's way of telling them, just die. That's how bad it was. So, you get into 1876, now this is one of the most important years. And this is when the Ottomans looked as though they might resurrect themselves. And it was by a man named Abdul Hamid II. Abdul Hamid II. He was the last great Ottoman Caliph. 1876. The Ottomans now, they went into war with Russia without his consent. In this period, I remember how I was telling you guys about how there was modernization. He declared the first Ottoman constitution. A constitution means a parliament. Before that, there was no parliament. There was a few advisors, and that was it. But the parliament and the constitution had so many spies of the West, of the Russians, and therefore the Ottomans lost the war. In a battle known as the Battle of Plevne, a guy named Osman Ghazi Pasha, not Osman Ghazi, not the founder, but a man named Osman Ghazi Pasha, tried to hold back against the Russians for so long, and as a result, the Ottomans didn't lose as much land. and he's known as a hero in Ottoman, in modern Ottoman folklore. But the Ottomans lost that land. In 1882, the Ottomans lost Egypt officially. Before that, there was some, semi-independent rule, a guy named Muhammad Ali Pasha, and he wanted to take over all of Ottoman lands, but was deprived by the Russian and French because the Russians and French wanted the Ottomans to continue so that they could tear them apart. So there was some, power vacuum, and then eventually the British just went and took in 1882 they took Egypt because of the opening of the Suez Canal, which meant that you could go through Egypt to get to India as opposed to going all the way around Africa. So now the Ottomans had lost Egypt. So 1882, you're thinking, what's going on with the Ottoman Empire? And Abdul Hamid II understands, my empire is about to collapse, I need to find a way to resurrect it. So he implements some policies. Number one, a policy called Pan-Islamism. Pan-Islamism is the idea that we are all Muslims, and he is the Caliph. And he is the Caliph, so he says, instead of trying to unite the Ottomans over this idea of Turkish identity, or Bulgarian identity, or Hungarian identity, or any of these identities, let's unite over our Islam. Pan-Islamism. He also therefore gained a lot of influence over the Indian Muslims, over the Indonesian Muslims, over the Muslims in the Philippines, to the point where Western powers began fearing his power and began asking for his aid when they were facing issues with the Muslim communities in their country. Sultan Abdul Hamid II, Pan-Islamism. The second policy, let's pay off all of Ottoman's debt. We can no longer be indebted to the West. How are we going to grow if we're constantly in debt to the West? 95% of all of the Ottoman Empire's debt was paid off by one simple man, by Abdul Hamid II, who often used his own wealth to pay off the debt. 95% of the debt. Not only this, but he said, okay, how am I going to strengthen the empire? He came up with a new regiment, a new army regiment, Sovet, the place where the Ottomans were founded, where they could track the lineage of each soldier. The Sovet regiment, that was his main army, the army that protected him. Very well drilled, very well skilled, and understanding how to fight in battle. Not only this, but how do I unite Muslims across the world? I'm now going to build something called the Hijaz Railway. The Hijaz Railway was a way of connecting Istanbul, Bosnia, all these different lands to modern day Mecca and Medina. So that's how he started connecting the Muslims. A man came to him, a man named Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl was the founder of Zionism. Modern Zionism, you guys know what's happening in Palestine right now, Israel. A guy named Theodor Herzl, who founded Zionism, went and approached Sultan Abdul Hamid II. He said, I'm going to pay off all the Ottoman Empire's debt. I'll pay all of it off. I'll pay all of it off. Just give us a tiny, tiny drop of land in Palestine. Tiny drop of land in Palestine. I thought that Abdul Hamid II said, I will not give you even an inch of land. I will not give you even an inch of land, because the land does not belong to me. Rather, it belongs to the Muslim nation. He said, but the only way you'll be able to take that land is by cutting up our dead bodies. That's how you'll be able to take our land. So this is the strength of a real Muslim leader, a true Muslim leader. A true Muslim leader. And so he fought for 33 years. He's trying to desperately protect the Muslim world. Desperately protect. And famously, all these Western leaders feared him. Otto von Bismarck, one of the famous German chancellors, famous in German history, said in the whole of Europe, 95% of Europe's intelligence, 90% of all Europe's intelligence is with Abdul Hamid. 5% with me and 5% with everyone else. That's how intelligent Abdul Hamid II was. He understood everything, essentially. However, in 1908, the rising nationalism, one issue was there was a group during Abdul Hamid's reign, because I was talking more Islam, but there was a secular identity forming in Turkey, forming in the Ottoman lands. So with more Islam, there's going to be a clear divide, secularism and Islamism. And that secularism created a group called the Young Turks. The Young Turks were a group of very, very secular, narrow-minded. They thought they were forward-thinking, but they were people who were educated in the West, in France and stuff, who saw the revolutions and saw the constitution, saw the democracy and freedom, and came to Ottoman lands and said, we want this here. So in 1908, there was a Young Turk revolution. Side note, quick footnote here. Remember how I mentioned the Donme, a group of cryptic Jewish Muslims, right? Who began gaining a lot of power and influence and wanted to destroy, the Donme means people who want to destroy Islam. They're outwardly Muslim, but inwardly they want to destroy Islam. Many of the Young Turks were the Donme, including a man who I'll talk about in a moment, who had significant influence on the Ottoman lands. And I don't want to go into conspiracy theories, but this I'll talk about it in a moment. Now, Abdul II is deposed. You have the new government, the Young Turk government. I'm just cautious of time. I just want to finish this, inshallah. The Young Turk government, who begin saying that they want to take over power. They implement a constitution. There's no clear guidance, no clear rules, no clear law, and suddenly the Ottomans are weak because they don't have a figurehead. They don't have a man who's going to take them forward. Before that, the Ottomans even won a war. 1898, they won a war against the Greeks. First time the Ottomans had won a war in years. They had won a war. And when you get to the year 1909, they begin losing so much land. They lost Bosnia. 1912 to 1913, there was the Balkan Wars. They lost half the Balkans. So now they have barely any power. They have a bit of the Hijaz, they have a bit of modern day Iraq, modern day Syria, and they have Libya, and that was it. They basically had nothing. No, Libya they even lost. They lost Libya in 1912 as well to the Italians. Umar Mukhtar tried to fight off, but they lost it. So the Ottomans are losing all the land. Suddenly, the Young Turks come in, the Ottomans losing land. So the Ottoman decline comes from the fact that now they had no clear governments. Because the nationalism, which I was talking about before, the clear national identity, the divide, the nationalism of the Balkans. I'm Bulgarian, I'm Serbian, I'm this, I'm that. Why am I going to be part of Ottoman lands? Left the Ottomans in peril. The one people that you think were never going to revolt against Ottomans were the Arabs. So now I'm going to go into World War I. So now World War I begins. The Ottomans didn't want to get involved. And World War I was the one thing that Ottomans should never have got involved in. And Abdul Hamid II has many memoirs where he spoke about it. What the Ottomans did wrong, a man named the three Pashas, you had the three Pashas, Ahmed Jamal Pasha, Esad Pasha, and another Pasha, I can't remember his name right now, I think it was Talal Pasha. These Pashas, what they wanted is they wanted the Ottomans to, just prosper, secular, maybe they were secular, but internally they were maybe a bit stronger. That was the idea, okay? And they said, look, we've been allies with Germany. Wilhelm II came to Ottoman's land under Abdul Hamid II. We're very strong allies with Germany. They're giving us a lot of wealth. They're giving us a lot of power. Let's team up with them. Despite the fact that the Ottomans were never allied with Austro-Hungary. Never. They were never in an ally with them. They hated Italy. So unofficially, the Ottomans were never allies with Austro-Hungary. They were instead just allies with Germany. When in reality, this was a very, very, very big mistake because all those lands, all the allied powers were landlocked. Therefore, the Ottomans had no control. What they should have done, and what Abdul Hamid II even says, is if they teamed up with Britain, then they wouldn't have been landlocked. Yes, they would have Austro-Hungary on their back, but the British would have fought them off. Nonetheless, you get into 1914. 1915, there was a battle known as the Battle of Izmir, where one man becomes very famous, and a very famous man and a very famous member of the Donma. Who knows what this guy's name is? Anyone knows what this guy's name is? Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk in the Battle of Izmir gains huge power, gains huge influence. He was the defender of Turkey. And Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, this is a fact, it's a matter of fact, is that he was a member of the Donma. He was a descendant of the Donma. Whether or not he had that intention, the cryptic Muslim Jew, whether he was not that or not, maybe. But whether the fact of his descendants as a part of lineage, he's from Thessalonica, which is Greece, as lineage he is part of the Donma, this is a fact of history. Conspiracy or no conspiracy, this is a fact. Now, World War I, Ottomans began losing. They had some successful battles. The Battle of Kutul Amare, where they defended some land, the Battle of Izmir, the Battle of Gallipoli, they began gaining some favor. But also they began getting wrecked by the British and the French. So you get to 1916, 1917, they lose. In 1917, they lose Jerusalem. 1918, the British occupied Istanbul. The Ottomans now have officially been wiped out. 1918, officially wiped out. Now, why is this? Why did they lose Jerusalem? Why did they lose Arabia? It's because the one group, and this is one thing that I want to talk about, the one group that you think would never revolt against the Ottomans. Because you can see the Eastern Europe, they were Christian, there was Christian minority and Muslim minority, okay, fine, they had their own national identity. But the one group that you think would never revolt against Ottomans, who were they? Who do you think revolted? Anyone? Arab revolt. 1916, the Arab revolt. Now, why did the Arabs revolt? There's a man named Lawrence of Arabia. Anyone heard of him? Lawrence of Arabia. Yeah, it's a movie as well. No, it's a man. Lawrence of Arabia was a white man. Went into Arabia, sent as a British spy to prop up Arab revolution against the Ottomans. The Arabs said, we don't need to revolt. Why would we revolt? The Ottomans are Muslim. And then the British came with their intelligence, with their spies. The Arabs fell victim to the greed. Because at the time, Arabs were what? They weren't the modern Arabs that you think of today, the Khalijis who are rich and coming and living in Mayfair. They weren't this. What they were was a group of nomadic groups, nomadic tribal Bedouin people. That they themselves viewed themselves as backwards at the time. The Ottomans kind of left them because the Ottomans couldn't enslave them. The Ottomans, the main reason they took over certain lands was so that the people who they would take would be part of the governance. The reason the Arabs, a lot of the Arab world wasn't taken part of the governance is because they weren't taken as slaves. They weren't taken as slaves. So as a result, they were never part of the governance of the Ottoman Empire. But they were generally left and protected. The Ottoman Sultan used to give them some wealth. Khalas, that was it. They paid their taxes, that's it. But they were also nomadic and Bedouin and they were always around. So they didn't really care for them. But what the Arabs put into, what the British and the French put into the heads of the Arabs, which still remains today in modern Arab supremacy and Arab nationalism, is that, hang on, this group of Ottomans are Turks. Wasn't the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ Arab? This is very confusing. Why are the Turks ruling over the Arabs? And what do the Arabs gain? We'll give you so much money that you will not even question why the Turks are ruling over you. You'll just be able to revolt. Arabs fell victim. Many different groups, many different tribes revolted against Ottomans. 1916, famous Arab revolt. There was a man named Umar Fakhruddin Pasha who tried to defend Mecca and Medina, defender of Mecca and Medina. But the Arabs still fought against him. The British went and then took Arabia. The Arabs were tricked because they thought we're going to fight against the Ottomans and the British are going to grant us their state. Whilst they were saying this, there was something known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement, literally named after two people, a French diplomat and a British diplomat, who literally tore apart the entire Arab world. They drew a line between Syria and Iraq. This part is you, this part is me. They divided the Arab world like it was a cake. That's literally how they divided the Arab world. And the Arabs revolted against the Ottomans, they revolted against the Caliph, they revolted against the Muslim world. And this is when you see the beginning of the fall of the Ottoman, the complete fall of the Ottoman Empire, the complete collapse. In 1918, the Ottoman Empire still existed as a concept. But the British basically destroyed and left the Ottoman Empire as a very, very small gap, very, very small area. And the Turks literally revoked the passports of the Ottomans who agreed this. Then you get 1919 to 1921, the Turkish War of Independence. Following the Turkish War of Independence, who was it led by? Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. You had the canning of the Ottoman Empire and the declaration of the Republic of Turkey. 1922, the end of 1923. The independent war ended in 1922. In 1923, the declaration of the Republic of Turkey. And what did Ataturk do? He, in 1924, abolished the caliphate. And what did he say? He said we need to abolish any remnants of the Ottoman Empire at all. He changed the Ottoman script. The way that they spoke, the way that they wrote, was coming from Arabic. So the way that Ottoman Turkish was written was in Arabic. No more Arabic. We're going to take it and we're going to turn it into Latin. Latin-based dialect, which is why modern Turkish is in Latin. It's coming from Latin. It's not in Latin, but you know the letters and everything is coming from Latin. He made it so the Quran was no longer recited in Arabic. Why be in Arabic? Recite it in Turkish. The Adhan was no longer recited in Arabic, it was recited in Turkish. Instead of saying Allahu Akbar, they said Tanrı uludur. Tanrı means God, uludur means come. Is the greatest. So this is what they were doing. They were trying to remove Islam in every single facet until they eventually abolished the caliphate. The caliph at this time was a man named Abdul Majid II. The caliphate no longer exists. So what the key points, before we open it to Q&A inshallah, the key points as to why the Ottomans began declining. I want you guys to understand it wasn't just the Ottomans disappeared like this. It was a very, very gradual process. You had the Ottoman sultans not being educated early on, 1700s. The sultans not being educated. And how that led to the Ottomans being behind the West. But then also, you had the Western world being 100 years ahead because of their ability to innovate and be technologically advanced and ahead of the rest of the Muslim world. You then had the Tanzimat reforms, which led to modernization and westernization of the Ottoman Empire, which also led to the Ottomans being in debt to the West. Okay. Then after that, just before that, around the same time, you had the internal issues of the Janissaries. As well as that, you had nationalism spreading. Modern nationalism and secularism as an ideology spreading across the Ottoman lands. And nationalism is what eventually destroyed the empire from within. You also had the Young Turk Revolution. Young Turk Revolution, which again comes as a result of nationalism and secularism and those different ideologies. You then had World War One, the Arab Revolt, and the revolution of the other powers. All of these issues can be going into the likes of colonialism, secularism, and nationalism. And then you had the likes of Ataturk and the Donme, who internally began sowing unrest. So I think that's inshallah where I'll come to an end about why the Ottomans had collapsed. Do you want to open that?